Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into the crowd at a public execution during the French Revolution, not from the view of the history books, but through what people actually saw, how they felt, what the atmosphere was like, and how something so brutal became part of everyday life. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights. Light a candle if you've got one, or just let the soft glow of your screen pull you in. Maybe let a soft hum play in the background, steady and low. Close your eyes gently and let the weight of today melt away. You're standing now in the heart of 18th century Paris, where a wooden frame rises in the square, waiting. The crowd gathers slowly, and history prepares to unfold, one drop at a time. It was early spring. The sun rose slowly and pale over the rooftops, warming the stone streets one cobble at a time. In a quiet corner of the city, away from the noisy cafes and watchful crowds, a team of carpenters, blacksmiths, and officials gathered inside a workshop. Their job that morning was simple in form, but heavy in meaning. They were there to build a machine. Not just any machine, but one that would change how France dealt with death. They called it the guillotine. The name came from Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, though he didn't invent it. He had only proposed the idea during a time of great unrest, when France was full of trials, prisons, and punishments. Guillotin had a quiet belief that if the state insisted on executions, then at the very least, they should be swift, equal, and painless. No more swords for nobles and ropes for peasants. One method for everyone. The design, however, came from a man named Dr. Antoine Louis. He was a respected surgeon and knew a thing or two about anatomy. He understood how to strike cleanly through bone and flesh. His idea was a tall wooden frame holding a heavy angled blade that dropped down on the neck using only gravity. Quick, mechanical, final. The actual building was left to Tobias Schmidt, a German harpsichord maker living in Paris. He was used to precision and fine woodwork. He had the hands of a craftsman, steady and skilled. That morning, Schmidt and his small team began to shape beams of oak and pine into something cold and strange. They measured the height carefully, about 14 feet, and cut strong grooves on both sides of the frame where the blade would slide without catching. There was no rush. They worked in silence. The smell of sawdust mixed with iron filings as the forge burned nearby, heating the thick metal that would soon be honed into a blade. It was shaped like an axe but tilted to one side, angled so it could pass through the neck faster, with less resistance. This shape was deliberate. A straight blade might crush. The angle sliced. Schmidt tested the grooves by sliding a wooden block up and down. It needed to fall smoothly, with no wobble. The men made small adjustments. They added cross beams for strength, iron fittings at the base, and a simple bench for the prisoner to lie against. A sliding board would help hold the neck still, and a wooden lunette, shaped like a half moon, would close over it like a clamp. Nothing fancy, all built for function, not fear. By noon, the main frame stood upright. It didn't yet feel like an object of terror. It looked like scaffolding. But even then, the air around it felt different, quiet, in a strange way. Everyone working knew what it was for. They didn't speak of it, but they moved with a kind of care you wouldn't use on any regular piece of furniture. This was something else. Meanwhile, in the National Assembly, the debates had already been settled. France wanted this new form of justice. The old methods were messy and uneven. Some executions took several swings of a sword. Others ended in strangled silence on a rope. The guillotine promised one thing: certainty. It didn't care about class, titles, or money. The blade would fall the same for all. But still, not everyone agreed. Some said it was too cold, too mechanical. Others feared it would make death too easy. One man called it a machine that kills with the calmness of a clock. But these were voices quickly overruled. France was in revolution. The crowd wanted change. The leaders wanted control. When the machine was finished, it had to be tested. At first, they used bundles of straw, then wooden logs, then, more grimly, dead animals. Some say that the first real test used the bodies of prisoners already executed. The reports vary, but all agree the blade worked perfectly. It fell fast, made little sound, and left no doubt. The final version was painted red. Some say this was to hide the blood. Others say it was simply tradition. The frame stood tall, firm, and almost still, until the blade dropped. That sudden motion, that quick silver line, became its only voice. A single cut, one blink, then silence again. Soon after, the guillotine was moved to public squares, first to the Place de Grève, then to the Place de la Révolution. Each time it was taken apart, carried by cart, and reassembled by the same hands that had built it. Schmidt's careful joints and iron fittings held strong through it all. The wood did not splinter. The blade did not dull quickly. It had been built well. What started as a proposal from a soft-spoken doctor had now become a symbol of order, equality, and fear. In the early days, people came in crowds to see it work. They brought food. They brought their children. For some, it was justice. For others, spectacle. But for the carpenters and smiths, it remained a job. Wood, metal, angles, weight. By the end of that long day in the spring of 1792, the guillotine stood quietly in the workshop, its blade gleaming slightly in the firelight. The men who had built it gathered their tools, wiped their hands, and went home to supper. Maybe they spoke of it, maybe not. But they had finished what they were paid to do. In time, the guillotine would come to define the revolution. But that morning, it had simply been a task, drawn on paper, shaped in wood, and tested until it was ready to serve. It begins early. A slow line of people walks down the wide streets of Paris, their boots scuffing against worn cobblestones. Some carry bread. Others carry children. Most carry nothing at all, just their quiet thoughts and the need to be there. They are all heading to the same place, the large square once called Place Louis XV, a space where statues once stood, where kings once rode through in carriages, now marked by something very different. At the center of the square is a tall wooden platform, and on that platform stands the guillotine. It is not the first execution here. It will not be the last. The crowd gathers slowly. Some people arrive while it is still half dark. They want a good view. These are the regulars, older men with arms crossed, street boys with quick eyes, and women in aprons who mutter to each other. They do not talk much. They have seen this before. As the sun rises, the square fills. The air is thick and a little damp. The smell of bread from morning vendors mixes with the stronger scent of the horses that pulled in the carts. You can smell sweat, too. And smoke. Always smoke. Rising from small fires nearby, where someone roasts chestnuts or warms cider. Even on execution days, people find ways to sell. There is a low hum across the crowd. Not loud talk, just whispers, murmurs, coughing. Someone sneezes. A child cries. A woman hushes him with a hand on his mouth. It is not a place for noise. Even the birds seem quiet. The wooden frame of the guillotine rises tall above heads. Its blade gleams in the morning light. It is not as bloody as people say. It is cleaned often, repaired, checked. A few men in dark coats stand near it. One is the executioner. He wears no mask. He is just a man doing his job. The others help him, lifting, tying, holding the list. Soon, the cart will arrive. But for now, the crowd waits. Most people are not shouting. Some are not even looking. They talk about the price of flour, about the cold last night, about a neighbor's baby who died last week. Life continues, even in places like this. There are smells of wine and sweat and hay. Some have brought stools to stand on. Some have climbed walls or wagons. A few sell small drawings, pictures of the condemned, copied by hand, with names scribbled underneath. They are passed from hand to hand for a few sous. Then a sound rises from the far street. A cart is coming. People lean forward. The hum becomes a buzz. No cheers yet, just motion. Heads turn. Children are lifted up. Someone pushes. Another curses under breath. The cart moves slowly. 2 horses pull it. One stumbles for a second, then finds its footing. A group of guards walks beside it. On the cart sits a prisoner. Sometimes it's one, sometimes more. This time, only one. They sit straight, but their hands are tied. The faces in the crowd shift. Some stare hard. Others look away. One woman crosses herself. Another spits. A few say nothing at all. Their eyes hold no anger, just tiredness. Many have seen this more than once. It is part of their week now, like market day. The cart stops beside the platform. The prisoner steps down. The executioner helps him walk. It is fast from here. There is no long speech, no begging. The man's coat is taken off. His hair is tied up. The blade is checked once more. The silence grows heavier. Even the children feel it. No one speaks now. Then, a click, a swish, a sound like a thick cloth being cut in one clean motion, and it is done. Some gasp, a few cheer, but most are quiet. The body is taken away. The crowd begins to shift again, like a sea pulled by wind. Some turn to go home. Others stay, waiting for the next name. There is usually more than one. The square does not stay bloody. Sand is spread to soak what the eye should not see. Workers sweep the boards. Guards stand firm. The sun climbs higher, and the crowd thins. A man sells warm wine to the few still watching. A boy follows behind, offering roasted nuts. A mother wipes dirt from her child's cheek and turns to leave. Life moves on, even after death has passed through. By midday, the square is nearly empty. Only the frame remains, tall and quiet in the sun. The smell of iron hangs in the air. A gull cries overhead. Some say they come for justice. Others come from habit. A few come from hunger, hoping to earn something, sell something, steal something. but most come for reasons even they don't understand. To be part of what is happening. To see with their own eyes what is said in whispers. To say they were there. The Place de la Révolution holds many faces. Some are afraid, some are curious, some blank, but all part of this strange new world where the old ways fall and new ones rise, with the blade as both symbol and tool. And tomorrow, they may come again. The streets are not yet busy. Only a few footsteps echo on the cobbled paths. Somewhere, not far from the place, a man rises quietly from his bed. His name is Charles-Henri Sanson. He is the public executioner of Paris. This is not a job he chose. It is one passed down through his family. His father did it before him. His son will likely follow. His home is modest, but clean. He lives with his family, his wife, children, perhaps a servant or two. Most neighbors know who he is. Some nod to him on the street. Others look away. People need him, but they do not always want to see him. Still, he walks with care, not pride or shame. He knows his work must be done with skill and silence. He eats a plain breakfast, bread, a bit of butter, sometimes coffee, though it is rare. He does not drink wine before work. He needs a steady hand. No shaking, no mistakes. That is the rule. He dresses with care, not in black, not in costume, as people might imagine. Just a dark coat, simple boots, gloves. His tools are already packed. He keeps them sharp. The guillotine blade, if needed, has been checked the night before. It is not his invention. It was designed by a doctor, Guillotin, and built by a craftsman. But Charles must keep it in good order. By now, a cart waits for him, a plain wooden cart with 2 wheels. Sometimes it carries his tools. Sometimes it carries the condemned. He rides quietly through the waking city. The streets slowly fill. The baker opens his shutters. A woman carries water in a pail. Children chase a stray dog. Life continues. But in the square, a crowd has already started to gather. People know an execution is coming. They have read the posters, or they have heard the church bells. Some come for justice, others for curiosity. Charles does not look at the crowd. He looks only at his men, his aides. They help him prepare. They set up the steps, the posts, the frame. They oil the blade. They tie the ropes. Everything must work perfectly. There's no room for delay. Then the condemned arrives. The man or woman is brought from the prison. They may be quiet. They may cry. Some scream. Some pray. Charles does not judge them. He does not speak unless needed. His job is not to think about guilt or innocence. His job is to make it quick. He helps them up the steps. He guides them gently if they cannot walk well. He may nod to them softly as if to say, "Be calm." Then, in one motion, he positions them, face down, neck in place. There is a hush. He gives the signal. The blade falls. It is over in an instant. The head drops into a basket. The body, still for a moment, is moved away. Blood is cleaned quickly. The aides work fast. There may be more to come. Often, there are many in a single day, especially during the Revolution. Charles does not look away. He keeps his eyes on his work. His face does not change, not from pride, not from pain. This is what he does. It is, in his own way, a craft, a service. The rest of the day is spent in quiet labor. He checks the blade again. It dulls with use. It must be sharpened. That task falls to him or his eldest son. The wood of the frame may need sanding or repair. The baskets must be cleaned, the cart scrubbed. He sometimes writes in a ledger. He records names, dates, details. He is part of the court system. Everything is done by order. Nothing is done in secret. In the evening, he returns home. He does not tell stories. He does not boast. He sits at his table, eats his meal, sometimes soup, sometimes beans. He speaks with his wife. He listens to his children. They are not afraid of him. To them, he is simply father. On days without executions, Charles trains. He lifts weights to keep strong. He studies anatomy. He teaches his sons, not just about tools, but about duty. The job is not about cruelty. It is about skill, control, calm. He reads books when he can. He visits the doctor. He checks on the forge where blades are made. He lives among the people, not above them, not apart, just beside them. But always he is known. Some whisper his name. Others call him Monsieur de Paris. That is the title for the city's executioner. It sounds grand, but the truth is quieter. At night, the square is empty. The scaffold sits silent. Birds land on the beam. Dust gathers at the base. No crowds, no drums, just the sound of wind through narrow streets. And in a house not far from there, a man sits by the fire. He rubs his hands. They're tired, worn, but steady. He closes his eyes. Tomorrow may come with more names, but tonight he rests. The guillotine stood tall, made of wood and iron, its blade gleaming in the daylight. But not many gave thought to what happened after the blade fell. While crowds gathered to watch the moment of death, others worked quietly in the shadows to manage everything that came after. There was a basket beneath the blade, and there was a cart waiting by the street. There were names on a list, and there were hands that cleaned the blood. This is the story of what happened once the crowd gasped and the blade struck. The basket, called a baquet, was usually made of wicker. It was wide and deep, lined with straw or cloth to soak up the blood. Its shape wasn't special, but its purpose was. It sat right under the wooden frame, ready to catch the head as it fell. Some were plain. Others had lids to hide the contents quickly. A few had handles on the sides so they could be carried off quietly. After the head dropped, an assistant, often called a valet de bureau or helper to the executioner, would lift it for the crowd to see. Not always, but often. The act was quick. The head was then placed in the basket. In some cases, a second basket held the body, or the body was left for a moment until workers could move it. There was a rhythm to these tasks. When executions were many, during the height of the revolution, several people were involved. There were boys who carried straw, men who wiped the boards, and always the man who kept the list. He was quiet, ink-stained, and often forgotten, but his job was clear. Mark the names, note the time, and check that the right person had been killed. Sometimes, mistakes happened. A name was crossed out too early. A man would be brought forward, but the paper said someone else. There was no shouting, no debate, just a pause, and then the next name was called. Once the execution was over, the cleanup began. It had to be fast. The stage, called the scaffold, was slippery. Blood soaked into the wood. Workers brought buckets of water, brushes, and sand. The sand was used to soak up what water could not. It was swept to the sides. Often, the boards were stained red for weeks. Carts were brought close, but not too close. The bodies were lifted, sometimes carefully, sometimes not, and placed in open wooden carts. These carts were not unlike those used for market goods, though older, heavier, and lined with cloth or hay. A worker drove them slowly through the streets, usually to one of the designated cemeteries. In Paris, the most known was the Madeleine Cemetery. Later, the bodies were buried in mass graves, often unnamed. When there were many executions in one day, as during the Terror, these steps repeated every few minutes. The workers didn't speak much. Some whispered, some prayed. Most just did what had to be done. Each part of the guillotine had to be checked between executions. The blade needed to be clean. The ropes tightened. The release reset. If anything stuck or failed, it delayed the whole process. And delays brought tension. The executioner, often from the Sanson family in Paris, took great care in this. Charles-Henri Sanson, for example, oversaw hundreds of deaths, but he wasn't a monster. He was methodical. He kept tools clean and blades sharp. He knew that a dull blade caused pain, and that pain was not the goal. The guillotine was made to be quick. That was the promise. In one small wooden box, usually kept near the scaffold, were spare blades, oil, cloths, and sometimes sewing tools. These were used to repair the rope mechanism or clean up between uses. Everything was planned. Everything had its place. The guillotine itself was taken down and moved when needed. This wasn't easy. The wooden frame was large and heavy. It had to be carried in pieces on carts. Workers reassembled it in new squares, sometimes overnight, always with care. Even the placement of the basket mattered. If it was off by a few inches, the head might fall outside. That happened? Not often, but enough to make workers check the position twice. And when it did, they cleaned it quickly, quietly, and made it right again. There was no glory in these tasks, no honor, only duty. Those who did this work were paid little. Some were shunned, some drank to forget. Others didn't talk about it at all. But without them, the executions would have been chaos. Sometimes people stole the straw from the basket. They believed it held power, or they wanted a piece of history. The guards tried to stop this, but it happened still. Children snuck close. Women passed scraps to each other. Tiny trophies of blood and fear. After the carts rolled away and the square emptied, the scaffold stood alone. Birds sometimes landed on it. Dogs sniffed at the boards. It was cleaned once more. Then the workers left, walking quietly back to the alleys and sheds they came from. No songs were sung, no stories told. Just another day, and another name on the list crossed out. In the end, the basket below the blade held more than heads. It held silence. It held the final breath of men and women, both guilty and innocent. It was not grand, but it mattered. And in the calm of the morning after, as the sun rose over the quiet square, it stood still, woven, worn, and waiting. The morning was still dark when the lanterns lit up the gray stones of the temple prison. The sky was heavy with mist, and the streets of Paris, though quiet at first, would soon fill with people. Inside the prison, King Louis XVI was already awake. He had not slept much. The guards stood at the door, silent, waiting. A priest had come to offer last prayers. The king had asked for 3 things: a candle, his pocket watch, and a quiet hour. From the small crowd that would gather outside, one man stood apart. He was not there to shout or weep. He did not carry a pamphlet or wave a flag. He was a shoemaker who lived 2 streets away, just another citizen who had come not to cheer or mourn, but simply to see. He had no strong feelings about the king. He had never seen him up close. That morning, he only wished to watch and understand what it looked like when a monarchy ended. Back in the prison, the king dressed slowly. He wore a plain coat, dark breeches, white stockings, nothing rich or royal. His hair had been cut short the night before to make it easier for the blade. His face looked pale, but calm. He had been told not to speak too much, not to resist. He nodded. He asked for scissors to trim his collar himself. A small gesture, but he wanted to be neat. As dawn broke, the guards let him out. The cart waited. It was simple, wooden, the same used for others. The king stepped up without help. He sat straight with the priest beside him. 2 guards rode with them. One held his hat low, trying not to meet the king's eyes. The cart moved slowly through the streets. People gathered along the way. Some shouted, some stayed quiet. A few crossed themselves. Children sat on shoulders to get a better look. The shoemaker was already near the Place de la Révolution, where the scaffold had been raised. He watched as workers finished setting the last boards. The guillotine stood tall, the blade hidden in its frame, clean and ready. The basket waited below. Soldiers lined the square, keeping the crowd back. The shoemaker found a place near the edge, behind a tall woman with a basket of apples. He stayed silent. When the cart arrived, a hush fell over the crowd. The king stood slowly. He looked around the square. Some said he tried to speak, to say he forgave those who had judged him. Others said he was cut off. No one agreed later. The guards took his coat. The priest whispered prayers. The king climbed the steps without help. He did not stumble. He did not resist. The shoemaker watched as the executioner tied the king's hands. Then, gently, they guided him to the plank. The blade was raised. The air seemed to stop. And then, one sound. A single strike. It was fast. Some gasped. Some wept. Most were silent. The head dropped into the basket. The body lay still. The priest crossed himself. The executioner held the head up. A few voices cheered. Others turned away. The shoemaker did not move. He stayed a while after the cart carried the remains away. He listened to the crowd. They talked in low voices. Some hurried home. Some stayed to stare at the red-stained boards. The shoemaker walked back through the narrow streets. He did not stop for bread or wine. He passed a boy selling songs about the king's death, but he did not listen. At his workshop, he opened the shutters and let the light in. He sat down and picked up a boot that needed mending. He did not speak of that morning often, but he remembered it, not as a moment of anger or joy, but as something final, a quiet end to a long chapter. The king had walked without struggle. The crowd had watched without storming the gates. It was not a riot. It was not a parade. It was just the end of something, witnessed in silence by thousands. And the shoemaker, in his quiet corner of Paris, went on mending boots as before, carrying that morning with him like a folded note, tucked away in the pocket of time. At the edge of the square, a woman with a small cart opened the lid on her basket. Inside were round loaves of rye bread, still warm from her oven. She had risen before the sun. She always did on days like this. Execution days were busy days. The crowd that came to watch also came hungry. Next to her, a boy no older than 10 was stacking bottles on a wooden table. They were filled with weak wine and watered ale. Some were sealed with wax, others with scraps of cloth. His father sat nearby, sharpening a knife and keeping an eye on the coins. Nearby, a man unfolded a cloth on the ground. It was filled with little papers, pamphlets, songs, poems. Most of them told the story of the person who was about to die. Some were written in a way that made the condemned seem like heroes. Others were written like warnings. People bought them to read while they waited, or to take home and share by firelight. All around, others were setting up too. Sellers of roasted chestnuts, dried apples, and meat pies. A woman passed with a tray of licorice and honey sticks. Another carried a tin of boiled sweets. Not many people could afford sweets, but children sometimes begged a coin from their parents. The smell of warm sugar and baked dough floated through the square. This wasn't a fair, and it wasn't a festival, but it wasn't entirely grim either. For the poor, execution days were often one of the few times they could sell to a large crowd. The rich didn't come often, but the working class did. Servants, shopkeepers, farmers in from the countryside. Some brought stools or blankets. Others leaned against the stone walls, eating slowly, eyes fixed on the scaffold. The scaffold stood at the center, still empty. The wood was dark from rain and years of use. Some children dared each other to touch its steps before the guards came. An old man with a pipe told anyone who would listen that he had seen 23 executions in the same spot. No one challenged him. Everyone just listened and chewed their bread. For many vendors, these mornings were a strange mix of routine and tension. They knew what to expect, how the guards would arrive, how the drums would sound, how the crowd would shift when the cart carrying the condemned appeared. But they also knew things could change quickly. Fights could break out. People could cry or faint. Once, a pickpocket was caught and nearly beaten before the guards stepped in. Still, the vendors kept coming. It was one of the only ways to earn extra money. Paris was hard. Bread was expensive. Work was not always steady. Selling food or drink to a crowd, even one gathered for something as dark as a public death, could mean the difference between going hungry or not that night. Some vendors had regular spots. Others arrived early to claim one. There were quiet rivalries. Some sellers offered better prices. Others were known for treats you couldn't find elsewhere. Clove-scented rolls or warm cider with nutmeg on cold days. Over time, regulars knew who to look for. There were also pamphlet sellers who became almost famous. One man, who wore a green cap, was known for singing the news aloud, turning court cases into rhymes. People would throw him small coins just to hear the latest scandal. Another woman, quiet and bent with age, sold copies of prisoners' last words, sometimes copied by hand, sometimes completely made up. When the crowd grew dense, so did the noise. People talked, argued, laughed. Some sang songs, others prayed. The air filled with the sound of footsteps, the low clink of coins, and the soft crackle of food being unwrapped. Then the drums would start. Low and slow, the guards would walk into place. Vendors knew then to step back, to stay behind the invisible line that kept them from the center. They paused their selling. Some bowed their heads. Others turned their backs. But most stayed close. Not out of disrespect, but out of habit. This was how the day went. After the execution, things were quieter. People drifted away, their faces thoughtful or blank, Some stayed to talk. Others lingered to finish their food. The scaffold would be cleaned. The square would clear. The vendors would pack up their goods, baskets lighter, coins jingling in their aprons or tucked into leather bags. There was little talk of what had just happened. People had seen it before. They would see it again. Life in Paris did not pause. The bread had to be baked. The wine had to be bottled. The pamphlets had to be printed. And the people, rich and poor alike, still had to eat. By afternoon, the square looked almost like any other day. A few scraps of paper blew across the cobbles. Some spilled cider dried in the sun. A crust of bread lay forgotten by a wall. The vendors went home the way they had come. Some walking, some pulling carts. Tired, but not shaken. It had been a good day for business, and tomorrow, perhaps, would be quiet. But if the list of the condemned was long, they knew they'd be back. Early again, baskets full, ready to feed the living in the shadow of the blade. Meanwhile, in a small back room behind the prison walls, away from the shouting crowds and the smell of iron and wood, a tailor lit a candle. His tools were laid out with care. A pair of shears, a needle, thread, and a flat wooden ruler rubbed smooth from years of measuring. The tailor was not a famous man. He had no sign hanging outside his door, no apprentices calling out prices to customers in the street. His work did not travel far. It did not end up in fine houses or on noble shoulders. It was worn by men and women for only a few hours, sometimes only minutes. They were called death shirts. Loose white linen garments, plain and undecorated. There was no need for buttons, no need for pockets, just a neck hole wide enough to slip over the head and sleeves that fell past the wrist. Some had ties to keep them closed. Most were left open. The prisoners wore these shirts to the scaffold. Not always, but often enough that someone had to make them. Sometimes the tailor worked under orders from the guards. Other times, he was asked directly by a priest or a family member. It was quiet work, strange work, but it paid, and in hard times, any work was better than none. The cloth came from whatever could be found. In the early days of the Revolution, the shirts were often made from scraps, old tablecloths, worn bed sheets, or unused bolts of fabric taken from shuttered shops. The linen didn't need to be fine, just clean, or clean enough. The tailor would cut it slowly, carefully, his hands steady, even if his thoughts were not. He did not always meet the people who would wear his work. Sometimes he was given a list of names and body sizes. A guard might say, 3 women, 1 tall man, 2 small lads, and the tailor would nod. He knew the shapes well enough. He'd worked in a city long before this, fitting coats for merchants and skirts for their wives. This was no different, except it was. When he did meet the condemned, it was never for long. They would come in under watch, thin and tired, with faces that didn't quite look up. He would measure quietly, never asking questions. A few whispered something. "Thank you," or "God bless." One woman asked if the shirt would be soft. He told her it would. The shirts were not fancy, but the work mattered. They had to fit loosely, so the blade would fall clean. No folds to catch, no collars to get in the way. Some prisoners went to the scaffold in their own clothes. But many, especially the poor, wore the white linen. It showed the crowd who they were. It made things simpler for the guards. The tailor worked by the light of his candle until the sun rose. His hands moved with memory. Cut, stitch, fold, tie, over and over. Sometimes he made 5 shirts in a day, sometimes 10. He worked through the noise of the city, through marching boots, distant drums, the cries from the square. He did not go to the executions. He had once, in the early days, followed a crowd to the Place de la Révolution. He had watched a man in one of his shirts step up to the platform. The fabric moved gently in the wind. Then it didn't. After that, he stayed behind his walls. There was work to do. There were more shirts to make. At night, he cleaned his tools. He sharpened his shears and wiped down the table. He folded the unused cloth and tucked it under his bench. He never kept the finished shirts. They were taken away as soon as they were ready. Sometimes he wondered what happened to them afterward. If they were buried with the bodies, if they were washed and used again. No one ever said. The tailor had a wife once and a daughter. They had left the city at the start of the Troubles. Too dangerous, his wife said, too uncertain. He had stayed. He told them he had work, and he did. Quiet work, honest work. The kind of work no one saw, but someone had to do. He never spoke of what he made, not to neighbors, not to passing tradesmen. If anyone asked what he did, he said he mended shirts, which was true enough. On the days he had no orders, he mended old clothes for coin, patched boots, restitched seams, made small repairs for those who could not afford new garments. But always, there was a shirt or two waiting. Always, someone would knock. A guard, a priest, a boy sent with a note. As the years went on, the orders slowed. The lists grew shorter. The revolution shifted. The crowds grew quieter. And still, the tailor worked. In the last year before the guillotine was moved, he made only 1 shirt. It was for a young man, barely more than a boy. The tailor measured him gently, said nothing, finished the shirt that same afternoon. He folded it carefully, placed it in a plain sack, lit a candle as the sun dipped low. Then he sat in silence, hands resting on the cloth, and waited for the knock on the door. In the prisons of revolutionary France, time moved slowly. Each hour was long, and each day felt like a lifetime. The walls were cold, and the straw on the floor did little to soften the hard stone. Prisoners waited, some for trial, some for their names to appear on a list, and some without knowing why they were there at all. Still, in this quiet, tense world, people found ways to stay connected, and one of the simplest, cleverest ways was through bread. Bread was a daily part of life in prison. Each prisoner received a small loaf, sometimes fresh, sometimes stale. It was given not out of kindness, but because even the most hated prisoner had to be kept alive until the court had its say. But to many, that loaf was more than food. It was a chance. A message could be rolled into a scrap of cloth or parchment, folded small enough to fit inside the hollow of a loaf. A baker on the outside might agree to help, or sometimes it was done in the prison kitchen. A tiny note, no larger than a coin, could hold everything. A name, a secret, a plan. These notes were passed to husbands, wives, friends, or even allies planning escapes. It was a risk, but for many, it was worth it. Most prison guards were not cruel. They were tired men, poorly paid and overworked. Some turned a blind eye when a note passed hands. Some even helped if they were given a little coin, or if the prisoner had something to trade. Others took no part, but didn't ask questions. It was easier that way. Prisoners who still had money might bribe a guard to carry a message outside the walls. This wasn't done with drama. It was often quiet, like handing over a bit of bread with a look that said, "Check inside." A guard might find a ring or a few coins and agree to carry a small letter out of sight. The goal wasn't escape. It was often just to say goodbye or to give comfort. Inside the prisons, there were helpers known as nurses or watchers, not doctors, but trusted prisoners who looked after others. These people sometimes acted as messengers too, carrying words from cell to cell. If someone had heard that their sister was also locked up across the yard, they might ask one of these helpers to bring a message. They whispered it, or scratched it on a bit of wood, or hid it under a bowl. Again, there was no rush. It was done slowly, carefully. Some used codes. A few prisoners were educated and clever. They wrote notes that looked like poetry or recipes, but the real meaning was hidden. A simple line like, "Let the dough rise by the window," might mean, "The escape will happen tonight." But most people didn't use codes. They wrote plainly and hoped no one would bother to read too closely. Not all messages were from the prisoners. Sometimes families outside sent words in. A wife might tuck a note into the crust of a gift loaf, telling her husband that she was safe or that the baby had survived the fever. A child might draw a picture on paper, hidden under a handkerchief. These messages were simple but precious. In a place where hope was thin, a small line of ink could be a lifeline. Bread was not the only method. Sometimes notes were hidden in buttons, sewn into collars, or pressed between pages of books. But bread was the most common because everyone had to eat and no one looked twice at a loaf. It was the perfect hiding place. A loaf could be split, filled, pressed back together, and baked again to seal the edges. If done well, no one could tell. But not all messages made it through. Sometimes a loaf was dropped or checked. If a note was found, the prisoner could be punished. Sometimes nothing happened, just a sharp look or a warning. But at other times, the message was read aloud in court, used as proof of disloyalty. This happened often during the Reign of Terror, when fear ran high and justice was swift. Even with the risk, people kept sending messages. They were quiet messages, words of love or simple facts. "I'm alive. We have not forgotten you. The dog waits by the door." These messages had power. They reminded prisoners that someone still cared, even if death was near. After execution, families sometimes tried to collect the last letter. Some prisoners wrote their final words and hid them in a loaf or under their shirt. If the body was returned, a guard might hand the note to the family or leave it hidden. Others were never found. But the act of writing, of trying to send something out, was part of what kept people human. There were stories of prisoners who never spoke, but who passed dozens of messages this way. Others wrote only once, carefully choosing their words. Most of these stories were never recorded. They weren't grand or heroic. They were quiet acts in a quiet war for dignity. Today, historians still find some of these notes, pressed into old books, hidden in sealed letters, or copied into journals. Some are only a line long. Others are full pages. They are faded, stained, and sometimes hard to read. But when we look at them, we remember that even in the darkest times, people found ways to speak. Bread became more than bread. It became a hiding place for courage. And so, in a prison cell of stone and straw, while the sound of boots echoed down the corridor and the city waited for another name to be called, a small loaf might sit on the floor beside a cup of water. Inside, if you looked carefully, you might find a folded piece of paper. It might say nothing more than, "I miss you." But in that place, at that time, it was enough. For the working class, the guillotine was not just a machine. It meant many things. For some, it meant fear. For others, it meant justice. And for many, it simply became part of the background. Something too common, too loud, too far from the field or workshop to feel real. The revolution had promised change. It had promised bread and fairness and an end to the cruelty of the powerful. When the guillotine was brought into the public square, many poor people saw it as a symbol of that promise. It wasn't hidden behind palace walls. It was out in the open for all to see. Rich men could fall before it, just like the poor. That meant something. In a world where the poor had always been the ones to suffer first. There were cheers at the first executions, loud ones, not because people liked blood, but because they had never seen a nobleman punished in public before. When King Louis XVI was led to the scaffold, many in the crowd were silent. Some cried, some nodded, some cheered. A few sellers offered warm wine. The poor stood in heavy shoes and worn cloaks and watched something they never thought they would see. A king brought low. But not everyone felt proud. Some watched with worry. They had seen this before, in a way, not with a tall blade, but with quick arrests, harsh rules, and little explanation. They had seen neighbors disappear in the night. They knew fear. The guillotine, they realized, could turn. It was a tool, not a promise. It could cut down a baker's son as easily as a nobleman. For many, life did not change after the blade fell. Bread was still scarce. Coal was still expensive. Rent still needed paying. The streets were still muddy, and the children still hungry. The speeches from leaders sounded loud, but the soup pot still boiled the same. The poor stood in lines for food, while others shouted about liberty. The guillotine, some said quietly, had become more about power than justice. Still, they came to see it. Not all, but many. Children stood on tiptoe. Men leaned on walking sticks. Women wiped their hands on aprons and squinted toward the scaffold. Not because they wanted to see someone die, but because they needed something to make sense of the world. When a criminal was named, when a spy was caught, when someone who had stolen from the public purse was punished, it felt, for a brief moment, like order. It was something they could understand. This man did wrong. This man paid. Some did not watch. They stayed home or kept their backs turned. The noise of the crowd told them enough. The silence that followed told them more. In the countryside, far from the cities, many peasants only heard about the guillotine in passing. Stories reached the farm through travelers and tired letters. Most villagers had never seen one up close. For them, it remained a symbol, more than a fact. A story told in hushed tones by the fire. And yet, the guillotine shaped the poor in quiet ways. It showed them what the state could do. It reminded them how close one could come to danger, without even knowing it. A joke overheard, a name on a list, a friend arrested, and suddenly, a cobbler's son was gone. A tailor's daughter vanished. The guillotine reminded them that power moved fast. There were moments of pride, when it was used to punish those who had truly harmed the people. Corrupt officials, cruel officers, hoarders of grain. There was relief. A mother could say to her son, "He stole while we starved. Now look." There was a strange comfort in knowing that no one stood fully above the law, even if the law was hard to follow and quick to change. Others spoke of the guillotine with tired voices. "Another today," they would say, and return to washing clothes or mending boots. The sound of the blade falling became familiar. Some said they could hear it even when they weren't there. Some began to forget the names of those who had gone. Over time, the poor grew quieter about it. The guillotine had become part of life, like the church bell or the tax collector. It was something always near, but never spoken of too much. In some homes, children asked questions. Why did they cut off heads? They would ask. And the answer came simply, because that's what they do now. When the executions slowed, the poor did not miss the guillotine. It had never brought them bread. It had never fixed their roof or healed their child. It had taken many, but it had given little. In the end, it became a thing of the past, not because people forgave, but because they grew tired. The scaffold was taken down, the blade put away, but the memory stayed. In quiet corners of Paris and dusty fields far from the city, the poor remembered. Some remembered fear, others remembered justice. Most remembered silence, the kind that follows a fall. And so, the guillotine passed into history, not as a symbol of hope or horror alone, but as something that meant different things to different people. For the poor, it was sometimes pride, sometimes terror, sometimes just another shadow on the street. But it was real. It was there, and they had seen it. The streets had not yet filled with footsteps, but inside the stone walls of the prison, another day had begun. In a back chamber not far from the holding cells, a small, tidy room sat behind a heavy wooden door. It smelled faintly of oil, leather, and something else. Hair. This is where the hair collector worked. No one spoke much of her. She was not a jailer, not a servant, not a family member. She came alone, most days, just before the noon light touched the bars of the windows. She carried a small satchel, plain and worn, and inside it were her tools: sharp scissors, a clean cloth, a comb, and a few folded strips of ribbon. She did not speak unless spoken to. She moved with quiet purpose. Her job was simple, but not many would have wanted it. Before the condemned were taken to the guillotine, their heads had to be prepared. This meant removing long hair, so the blade would fall cleanly. Tangles, buns, and braids could shift the angle of the cut. And in these final moments, even the state wanted things to run smoothly, efficient, orderly. So the hair was taken. In many cases, it was simply discarded. But sometimes, it was saved. Some people wanted to leave behind a lock of hair for a loved one. A farewell gift. A last piece of themselves. Others, especially in the early years of the Revolution, requested that their hair be kept for more public reasons, to be turned into a brooch, a small ornament, even part of a mourning ribbon worn by their family. hair could also be sold, especially if it was thick, healthy, and long. Wig makers in Paris paid good coin for hair in fine condition. Noblewomen had once worn towering powdered wigs, and even in humbler homes, additions of human hair were used to puff out a style or hide thinning patches. Though fashions were changing, the market still existed. A quiet trade that didn't ask many questions. Then there were other reasons, more hidden. Some believed that hair from a condemned person carried power. Not magic, exactly, but a trace of something stronger. Some thought it brought protection if braided into a cord. Others thought it was unlucky. It depended on who you asked. But there were whispers of amulets, tiny pouches sewn shut, or pieces kept in drawers, wrapped in linen. The hair collector had heard these stories, but she didn't pay them much mind. Her work was steady, methodical. She brushed the hair first, gently and quickly. She snipped just enough from the nape and tied it with a ribbon. Some strands were too short to save. Some were tangled beyond repair. But she always tried. If a family member had made a request, the lock would be passed along later, after the execution. Sometimes through a guard, sometimes through a friend waiting near the gate. Other times, there was no one left to give it to. Those pieces stayed behind in the collector's chest, tucked in neat paper folds. She didn't keep them for sentiment. It was just part of the job. People came and went. The guillotine didn't stop for long. In the days of the terror, there were more names than there were hours. One after the other. Nobles, servants, priests, widows, poets, lawyers, bakers. The blade didn't care who they were. It was always the same sound in the end. And still, the hair was trimmed. There were no mirrors in the chamber, no chance for vanity. Sometimes, the person being prepared would ask what would happen to their hair. The collector would answer simply, "It will be tied and saved." Some asked for a specific color ribbon. Others didn't say a word. She once prepared the head of a man who had written poetry in the cell beside his. His hands trembled as she worked, but he managed to say, "Tell my sister, it's the part of me I liked best." His hair was thick and dark and fell across her fingers like thread. She tied it with blue. There was no ceremony, no prayer, just careful, practiced hands and the quiet before the final march to the scaffold. Outside, life went on. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts and bread. Children played by the river banks. Laundry hung from windows, even as heads rolled in the square. But inside the prison, the rhythm was slower, steady, worn into the walls. The hair collector rarely watched the executions themselves. She had seen a few early on, but stopped after that. It wasn't part of her task. She stayed in her room, sorting the locks, writing small notes to identify them. Sometimes a name, sometimes only a date. Over the years, the requests grew fewer. People no longer asked for their hair to be saved. There were too many deaths, too many families torn apart. The grief was too heavy, and the city grew tired of remembering. Still, she showed up each day, carrying her satchel, her scissors, and her quiet focus. Long after the worst years passed, when the blade had rusted and the scaffold was taken down, the hair collector's chest was found in the attic of a quiet house outside the city. Inside were dozens of bundles, some tied with silk, others with string. A few had names. Most did not. No one knows what happened to all of them. Some were buried. Some were burned. A few may have been kept by museums or historians, though no one says so openly. But for a short time, in a strange corner of history, someone had made it their task to gather what was left behind before the final act, to tie it gently, to mark it quietly, and then let the blade fall. Meanwhile, a boy woke early that morning, long before the sun touched the crooked rooftops of Paris. The air inside their small bakery was still warm from the oven fire his father kept burning through the night. It smelled of ash and flour, of rising dough and yesterday's crusts. His name was Luke, and he was 7 years old. His father handed him a crust of bread, still warm, and said, "Come on, son. We're going to the square today." Luke didn't ask why. He knew better than to question his father when he had that faraway look in his eyes, the kind that meant something serious was happening. He followed, biting into his bread, letting the steam from it warm his face as they stepped into the morning fog. The streets were muddy from last night's rain, and the sky hung low with clouds the color of pewter. The city was already awake. Carts rattled over cobblestones. Old women swept their doorsteps. Dogs barked at chickens. But there was something different about today, a hush that followed them, even as they reached the busier roads. His father didn't say much. He carried a basket of loaves to sell, but that wasn't why they were going. Luke knew that much. People were walking in the same direction, and not many of them were smiling. When they reached the square, the crowd had already gathered. Luke had never seen so many people packed together before. There were old men in patched coats, women with babes wrapped against their chests, boys not much older than him, perched on barrels or ledges. Everyone was facing the same thing, a tall wooden structure in the center, with wide steps and something metal that caught the weak light of morning. The guillotine. Luke had heard the word whispered before. At the bakery, in the market. Sometimes late at night when his father thought he was asleep. He'd never seen it until now. It looked simple, just wood and blade. But the silence around it made Luke feel cold. He clutched the crust of bread tighter in his hand. His father found a place near the edge of the crowd where Luke could see over a stone wall. He lifted the boy up and sat him on it. "Stay still," he said gently. Luke nodded. He watched. Drums started, just a low beat, steady and slow. A group of soldiers came through the crowd, parting it like a plow through wet earth. Behind them was a cart drawn by a horse. On the cart sat a man. He looked calm, too calm. Luke didn't understand how someone could sit so quietly when all these people were watching. The cart rolled through the square, stopping at the steps of the guillotine. The man stood. A priest said something. Luke couldn't hear the words. The man climbed the steps. His hands were tied, but he walked on his own. Luke looked at his father. The baker's face was still, tired, like he'd seen this many times before. The man knelt. 2 men helped him. They fastened the wooden boards around his neck. Luke could see the man's face, turned to the side. His eyes were open. Then the blade fell. It was quick, a sound like metal through cabbage, a gasp from the crowd. The body did not move. The head dropped into a basket. Luke blinked. He didn't cry. He didn't look away. He didn't understand everything. But he knew this was not a game. This was real. His father lifted him off the wall and said, "That's enough." They walked back through the crowd, slower now. The air felt heavier, like it pressed against their skin. Luke saw a woman wiping her eyes with her apron, a man drinking from a flask, a boy laughing, but no one laughed with him. Back at the bakery, his father washed his hands and started kneading dough for the next batch of bread. Luke sat quietly and watched. Finally, he asked, "Why did we go?" His father didn't answer right away. He kept kneading. "Because you need to see what power does and what fear looks like," he said. "And what happens when people forget to care." Luke nodded. He didn't quite understand it all. Not yet. But he remembered the silence, the blade, the way the man had walked on his own. That night, Luke dreamed of the square. But in his dream, the crowd was gone. The guillotine stood alone, covered in morning fog. And beside it, a single loaf of bread sat on the stone wall, waiting. And in time, Luke would grow. And he would remember, not the noise, not the blood, but the silence before the drums, the stillness of the man, the way his father had looked away, just for a moment, when the blade dropped. Not all lessons came with words. Some came in quiet mornings, in muddy boots, and in crowds that held their breath as history passed by. Luke never forgot. On the far side, in a narrow room behind the courthouse in Paris, a woman sat with a quill in her hand. The ink pot near her elbow was half full, its surface calm. The paper before her was clean and waiting. Her name was Jean. No one asked much about Jean. She came early, stayed late, and walked the same path each day with no complaint. Her job was not glamorous, but it was important. Jean wrote the names. In the days of the guillotine, justice moved fast. Trials were short, sentences were final, and the lists had to be accurate. Jean was tasked with writing the names of the condemned. She copied them from the court records in careful, steady strokes. There could be no mistakes. A misspelled name could mean the wrong person was taken. A forgotten one could mean someone was left waiting, confused, afraid. Jean knew this. She double-checked everything. The list began with the full name. Then came the age. Then the charge, often written in only a few words. Enemy of the people. Royalist plotter. Disruptive speech. Sometimes it was vague, sometimes cruelly simple. The reason didn't matter much by the time Jean received the papers. Her job was to make the list clear and legible for those who would call out the names at the scaffold. When the ink dried, Jean folded the paper neatly and placed it in a leather pouch. She tied it with a string, the same knot each time. Then, she stood and left the room, her wooden shoes tapping quietly on the stone floor. She passed through a hallway filled with dust and echo, then stepped out into the light. The city was already waking. Vendors were setting up stalls. Children were chasing each other near the fountains. But Jean kept her eyes down and walked straight. The path to the prison was not long. Along the way, Jean passed others who had their own duties. A man sweeping the street, a woman with a basket of bread, a guard leaning on his musket. They didn't speak to her. Everyone knew what the pouch meant. It was the list. At the prison gates, she handed the pouch to a clerk, who nodded and signed a page. He opened the pouch, scanned the names, and handed it back. Jean continued inside. The prison air was thick. The walls held voices, whispers, from behind wooden doors. She walked past them without stopping. In a central chamber near the back, she met the officer of the day. He was the one assigned to read the names aloud. They did not talk much. He opened the pouch, unfolded the list, and scanned it. Jean waited. If there was an error, it had to be fixed now. If not, she would be dismissed. Most days, there was no error. Once, early in her work, Jean had spelled a name wrong. It had been a small mistake, a letter left out, but it had led to a delay. The wrong prisoner had been pulled from their cell. After that, Jean checked everything twice. When her task was done, she left the prison and returned to her room near the courthouse. There, she washed her hands and prepared the next page. Sometimes there were only a few names. Sometimes there were many. During the peak of the revolution, the pages were long, and Jean barely had time to rest. At night, Jean sat by the window. She did not look toward the scaffold. It stood not far away, near the center of the city. The guillotine cast a long shadow, even when the sun had set. From her room, she could hear the noise of crowds when the executions happened. Shouting, singing, drums. But she did not go to see it. She had seen it once, early on. A young woman had tripped walking up the steps. Her hair had come loose, and she looked out into the crowd. Jean had not forgotten her face. That was enough. The lists continued, day after day. Jean kept writing. Her hands ached, but she said nothing. The guards knew her. The officers nodded as she passed. She did not try to make friends. She did not tell people what she did. Some nights, she dreamed of the lists, names she had never heard before, names she had written years ago. She would wake and go sit at her desk, watching the ink dry in the lamp's glow. One morning, the list stopped coming. Jean came to work and found her desk empty. No papers, no names, no orders. She waited all day, then went home. The next morning, the same. A few days later, someone told her the executions were slowing down. The reign of terror was ending. The guillotine did not stop right away, but Jean's job ended before it did. One day, a man came with a key and locked the office door. Jean stood on the steps for a while, holding her empty pouch. Then she walked away. Years later, no one remembered her name. The list writers were never honored. There were no statues, no memorials. But the lists had mattered. Each name had been a person. Jean had known that. She had written each one carefully. And when the paper was folded and the ink had dried, she had carried it in silence. That was her duty. Quiet, precise, final. The street is quiet just after dawn. Fog hugs the rooftops and clings to the ground. Somewhere, a rooster calls, muffled by the heavy air. Inside a narrow workshop near the edge of Paris, the saddler is already awake. His hands are stained with dye and oil. His fingers are strong but stiff, already bent slightly with age. He is not a rich man. He wears a brown apron, patched twice. His home is no more than a room above the shop, with straw in the mattress and a low ceiling that creaks when he moves. But he has his trade, and in these uncertain times, that is everything. He is not famous. He does not sign his name to his work. But every week, one of his carts rolls through the city, pulled by horses and watched by crowds. It carries men and women who will not return home. And though he does not watch the executions, he knows his carts are there, waiting quietly beside the scaffold. He is a saddler by training. He learned from his father how to shape leather, how to set rivets, how to bend wood with steam and time. When the revolution began, fewer people needed saddles. Fewer could afford them. So he turned to other work, carts mostly. At first for bread, wine, barrels. Then, more often, for the city, for the prisons. These are not ordinary carts. They are low and open, with a simple flat base and tall sides. No seats, no decorations, just wood, nails, and the smell of grease. They are not built to comfort. They are built to carry. Still, he does his work with care. The boards are sanded smooth. The corners are rounded, not sharp. A thin layer of straw is placed on the floor. Not much, but enough to soften the ride over cobblestones. If asked, he says only that he builds what is needed. But inside, he still thinks like a craftsman. He still takes pride in making things that do not break. He measures each board himself. He checks the axles for balance. The wheels are wide and strong, reinforced with iron rings around the rim. It is important they do not splinter under weight. A broken wheel on execution day would cause a scene. He knows this. He avoids it. The city pays him in coin, though not always on time. Sometimes he must wait weeks. Still, he continues, not because he believes in what the carts are used for, but because he has a skill, and the world, as it is now, has little use for saddles. The carts are stored behind the prison until they are needed. Covered, usually. Pulled out at dawn, washed if dirty. When they move slowly, surrounded by guards. The condemned stand or sit in the back, arms bound. Sometimes they speak, sometimes they don't. He never asks their names. He never watches. Once or twice, he saw a cart he built turn the corner of his street, heading toward the square. He turned away, but he could still hear the creak of the wheels, the sound of his own work on the move. There is no ceremony in his shop, just steady labor, the smell of warm wood shavings, the scrape of a file, a pot of glue warming on the coals. He works alone. He does not have an apprentice. No one is eager to learn this kind of cart making. Still, he keeps a notebook, small, stained, pages curling at the edges. In it are rough sketches of wheels, braces, axle pins. Not because he must, but because he likes to remember how things fit together. Because once, long ago, he thought he might make coaches. Something grand, something elegant. That dream is quiet now, but not fully gone. Sometimes, after he finishes a cart, he stands back and looks at it for a long time. Just stands there in the stillness, rubbing his hands together. The cart is plain, simple, but strong. It will do its job. He does not think of the people who will ride in it. He cannot. That is not his place. And yet, there are little things. A smoother edge here, a stronger nail there, details that no one asks for, but he adds them anyway. Perhaps because, deep down, he cannot forget that people stand inside his work. Even if only for a moment. Even if it is their last. The streets are not always kind to carts. Stones loosen, mud clings, horses stumble. He knows this, so he keeps improving the design. Thicker wheels, better braces, fewer rattles. Each one is better than the last, though no one thanks him. That's fine. He is not in it for thanks. At night, the forge cools. The tools are cleaned and hung. He eats simple meals, bread, cheese, sometimes beans or thin stew, He sleeps on a mattress stuffed with straw. He does not speak much of his work, not even to his brother, who lives 3 streets over. They talk about weather or illness or the cost of soap, not about carts. One day, he knows, the executions will stop. The blade will fall silent. The crowds will thin. The square will quiet. And when that happens, he may go back to saddles, or he may retire. He has no wife, no children, just his hands, his tools, and the steady rhythm of wood meeting iron. Until then, he builds, quietly, carefully. The saddler who now makes carts for death, not war. His life marked not by speeches or causes, but by quiet, useful work. He may not be remembered, but the wheels he shaped carried history. And still, every time he hears one turn the corner, he knows. His craft rolled there first. Now you walk along a narrow path of packed earth, past the old walls of stone. A small cemetery waits at the edge of the quarter. It is quiet here, just birds, the rustle of leaves, and the far-off sound of a carriage wheel turning. This is where many of the dead were taken, those who had fallen beneath the blade of the guillotine. A place of final rest, though there was little peace in how they got there. In the early days of the French Revolution, when the executions began, there was still a sense of ceremony. Bodies were returned to families if they could pay. Sometimes they were buried with a name, a small wooden cross. But as the executions grew more frequent, dozens in a single day, this changed quickly. There were simply too many. Most of the condemned were brought to cemeteries on the edge of the city. One of the most well-known was the Cimetière de la Madeleine, a modest burial ground near the Place de la Révolution. It was not built to hold hundreds, but soon that is what it faced. After each execution, the bodies were loaded into carts, wooden wagons, sometimes padded with straw, sometimes not. The executioners worked quickly. Their assistants tied wrists and ankles. Heads were often placed with the bodies, sometimes tucked beneath arms. The guillotine was meant to be clean, efficient, but death, in truth, was still messy. The carts would rumble slowly toward the cemetery gates, guarded and watched by quiet men. There were no long prayers, no speeches, no family gathered with flowers. The graves were already dug, wide trenches in the earth, large enough to hold dozens at a time. In many cases, the bodies were stacked, one layer, then a second, then a third. Lime was sometimes scattered to control the smell. The soil was shoveled back in with little ceremony. These were mass graves, dug with speed and desperation. The grave diggers worked all day, sometimes into the night. Their job was silent and steady. There was no shortage of work. In just 1 year, cemeteries like Madeleine became full, completely. The ground rose where the bodies settled. The air began to change. The smell of decay was heavy. People living nearby began to complain. By then, other burial grounds had already been put into use. Picpus Cemetery, Arancis Cemetery, and a few hidden places not officially recorded. Still, the flow of the dead did not stop. The guillotine was used nearly every day during the Reign of Terror, from mid-1793 to mid-1794. Some days, it claimed more than 40 people. On one of the bloodiest days, June 17th, 1794, over 50 were executed. By then, the cemeteries were struggling to keep up. Burial crews worked faster. Graves were dug even wider and deeper. There was no longer time for wooden markers. Most names were lost. And yet, life continued all around these places. Children played near the cemetery walls. Vendors passed by on their way to the markets. Locals began to avoid walking too close, especially in summer. The stench could be strong for blocks. Later, some of these burial grounds were closed. Years after the executions ended, certain cemeteries were moved or built over. Streets now run where the graves once lay. Apartment buildings sit atop former trenches. But in places like Picpus Cemetery, the memory still remains. Picpus is different. It is still quiet, still green. It holds one of the few known lists of names. Over 1,300 people buried there after execution, from both noble and common families. You can still walk there today. Behind a tall gate, through a small chapel, the graves lie in neat rows. It is peaceful now, calm. The wind still moves in the trees. In the early 1800s, after the Revolution, efforts were made to identify the dead. Some families came to find loved ones. Many failed. There were no records. The names had vanished. The graves had no signs. The earth had shifted. The truth is, most of the victims of the guillotine, rich and poor alike, were laid to rest in silence, unknown, their stories lost. But the cemeteries still remember. Beneath the soil, the bones remain, layer upon layer. Quiet. Still. Back in the city, the places where the guillotine once stood have changed. Streets have been renamed, statues built. The Place de la Révolution is now the Place de la Concorde. Tourists gather where the scaffold once stood. They take photos, watch the fountains, walk past without knowing. But just beyond, in corners of the city, few people visit. The old cemeteries still hold their secret weight. And every now and then, when construction begins or foundations are dug, bones are found, lined neatly in rows, stacked as they were long ago. A quiet reminder of what once happened here. You stand now at the edge of that old burial ground. The light is fading. The trees sway gently above you. You can still feel the shape of the earth under your feet, a little raised, a little uneven. There are no voices, no footsteps, only the wind and the long, forgotten silence of the dead. In one of the cells, a man sits on a straw-filled mattress. He knows what day it is. His name has been read aloud. His execution is scheduled for the afternoon. There is no shouting, no panic, no last-minute hope. He has accepted it. And now, he waits for what is known as the dernier repas, the last meal. Not everyone in history got one, but during the years of the French Revolution, especially under the official use of the guillotine, it became something of a custom, a quiet ritual before the end, a plate of food, a final act of humanity, offered by a system that had already decided to take a life. For many prisoners, the last meal was simple: bread, cheese, a cup of wine or water, nothing fancy, just what was on hand. In those crowded revolutionary prisons, La Conciergerie, the Luxembourg, the Temple, resources were stretched. Food was not meant to comfort. It was meant to fill the stomach one final time. But not all were treated equally. Some prisoners had money or influence, even in their final hours. They could pay the guards, or their family might send something in. In those cases, the meal could be rich, even indulgent. Records tell us that some prisoners ate roasted meat, fresh fruit, or small pies. One nobleman asked for oysters, another, a bottle of Burgundy. These meals were not celebrations, but moments of quiet choice. There is the story of Georges Danton, the revolutionary leader who once ruled the very courts that would later condemn him. On the morning of his execution, it's said he asked for beef stew and red wine. He wanted no sermon, no long speeches, just food and silence. Marie Antoinette, the former queen, ate very little before her death. According to reports, her final morning meal was plain bread dipped in broth. She had been living in confinement for months. Her appetite was gone, worn away by stress and sorrow. She dressed carefully and walked to the scaffold with heavy steps. Then there was Robespierre. Once the voice of the revolution, he became its victim. His final hours were chaotic. He had been wounded during his arrest, his jaw shattered by a failed suicide attempt, or perhaps a bullet from the gendarmes. He couldn't eat much. He lay in pain, unable to speak. And when morning came, he was carried to the guillotine without a meal at all. Outside of France, the tradition of last meals also existed, but it varied widely. In England, condemned prisoners at Newgate or Tyburn were sometimes given ale and bread, or boiled beef. In rare cases, they were allowed to dine with a priest or family member. In German-speaking regions, a final sweet, such as a honey cake or preserved plum, might be offered as a small comfort. These were not grand feasts. They were quiet gestures for commoners, peasants, workers, or the poor. The last meal was often whatever the prison kitchen could spare: gruel, a crust of bread, sometimes nothing. These prisoners died without ceremony. They were loaded into carts with others, taken through muddy streets, and beheaded before crowds of strangers. No one brought them cakes or wine. Still, in every one of these meals, there was a small trace of dignity, a last moment to feel human, to taste something, to hold something warm. The ritual also served a purpose for the living, the guards, the jailers, even the families. It softened the harshness of the day. It gave the illusion that mercy still existed, that justice, though final, could still have manners. In some cases, the final meal was shared with others. Prisoners condemned together would eat side by side. There are accounts of quiet meals with no words spoken. Bread passed hand to hand, a single jug of wine between 4 people. In other cases, the condemned ate alone, too anxious or ill to finish their food. Many left their plates unfinished. Some pushed the food away. One young woman, barely 20, asked only for a cup of milk. She drank it slowly, then placed the cup on the stone floor and folded her hands. Others asked for nothing at all. Their stomachs were too tight with fear. There is no clear rule across time or country. The last meal depended on the jailer, the prison, the time period, and the prisoner's means. But across cultures, the idea of a final bite, a last sip, seems to repeat. Whether it was a bowl of rice in Japan, a slice of bread in Italy, or soup in Poland, the meaning was always the same: one last quiet moment before everything changed. Even in recent times, the idea has carried on. But in the 18th century, during the age of the guillotine, it was not about headlines or spectacle. It was personal. It was close. You sat with your bread. You ate what you could. And then you waited. By afternoon, the light shifts in the prison. The guards return. The door opens. The plate is taken away, clean or not. The time has come. Outside, the crowd gathers. The blade gleams in the sun. The streets are filled with voices, and yet the prisoner walks in silence. The last meal is gone. Only the memory remains. A small warmth in the stomach. A final act of life before the fall. We walk slowly toward the Place de la Révolution. It is early, just past sunrise. The sky is pale and cloudless. The stones underfoot are warm from yesterday's sun, and they will grow hotter as the day unfolds. Ahead stands the guillotine. It is tall and simple, a wooden frame, not polished, not ornate, just rough beams held together with thick bolts. It rises like a scaffold, quiet and still for now, but not forgotten. Even from a distance, it gives off its own presence. As we come closer, the smell changes. You would not expect it, but the scent of old blood is already here, even before the crowd arrives. The wood of the platform has soaked in much over time. Damp days, dry days, rain, sweat, and death. Today, it smells like iron and heat. The metal blade, once silver bright, is now dull and stained. It's been used too many times. You can smell the rust if you get close enough. There is a bitterness to it, like wet coins left out in the sun. It's sharp in the nose, but quiet. Just another part of the place. There are ropes nearby, used to pull and reset the mechanism. They smell like sweat and old fibers. The hemp is worn, handled by many hands and always under tension. A faint smell of oil lingers too. Someone has tried to keep the moving parts from sticking. Not for mercy, but for efficiency. The crowd begins to gather. Shoes crunch over gravel and straw. People speak in low voices. A few joke, but not loudly. Most just wait. Many come out of habit. Some bring children. Others stand far back, trying not to meet eyes. The smell of the crowd is strong. Bodies pressed together in the sun. Clothes that haven't seen water in weeks. Wool that holds every trace of smoke, grease, and labor. There is food being eaten too. Bread from a pouch. Bits of cheese, sharp and aged. A woman close by is peeling an onion. Its smell cuts through everything else, clean and harsh. Others sip from small flasks, and the sourness of cheap wine or weak beer floats by. Nearby, someone is smoking. Not tobacco, just dried herbs, burnt in a pipe that smells like old wood and sweat. Closer to the platform, it is warmer. The sun is climbing now, and the wood of the guillotine gives off its own scent. It's the smell of old oak soaked in sun and use. It holds traces of everything it has seen. Blood, dust, oil, rot, polish, and ash. The smell is not strong, but it is constant. You cannot ignore it, but it also doesn't shout. Flies gather near the base. They know what comes next. They've been here before. They buzz lazily, unbothered. If you step close enough, you'll notice the sour smell near the edge of the basket, where it waits beneath the blade. It is not fresh. It is the deep, settled odor of too many endings in the same place. Even the hay beneath the scaffold holds the story. It was laid to soak up what must fall, and though it is replaced now and then, the scent stays. Warm straw mixed with iron and rot. It smells like something that once lived. Because it did. The breeze picks up, and with it comes a strange mix of smells. The river nearby gives off a brackish scent, mud and water warmed by the sun. Someone in the crowd wears perfume, but it cannot cover much. It floats past in a sweet cloud and is gone. Another man coughs into a cloth. His breath smells of garlic and hunger. A bell rings in the distance. The time is near. You can feel it in the shift of the crowd. People move a little closer. Some stand on toes. Others lower their eyes. There is silence for a moment, deep and uneasy. And then the executioner arrives. He smells of leather and ash. His boots are worn. His apron is dark and stiff. He moves with routine, not emotion. He checks the ropes, tests the blade, brushes away the straw with the back of his hand. The smell of metal rises again. Iron and sweat. Oil and fear. No one speaks now. Even the birds have gone quiet. The person condemned today walks slowly, guided by guards. Their scent is human and close. Skin, cloth, breath. You smell the fear before you see it. It's not dramatic. It's just the heavy smell of someone who hasn't slept, hasn't eaten, and knows what happens next. The blade does what it is made to do. And for a moment, the smell in the air is sharp and thick. You may not even notice it at first, but it's there. Blood, warm and bitter, fresh and unmistakable. It doesn't last long. The heat of the sun and the motion of the crowd begin to stir it into the wind. Then the flies return. The body is taken away. The basket is emptied. Straw is swept, ropes rewound, the blade wiped clean. The guillotine stands again, quiet as before. The crowd begins to move, slowly, as if nothing strange has happened. A child cries, not understanding. A man finishes the last bite of his bread. A woman sells roasted chestnuts from a basket nearby. Their smell warm and sweet, and almost enough to mask the rest. But not quite. Even long after the crowd is gone and the square is mostly empty, the smell stays. Not always strong, but always there. The guillotine does not speak. It does not shout, but it leaves behind a scent that stays on your clothes, in your hair, on your tongue. A scent of wood, rust, blood, sweat, sun, and silence. And that is what the guillotine smells like. But the guillotine did not always stay in one place. Sometimes, without warning, it was taken apart in the dark, moved down muddy roads, set up again before dawn, and when the people woke, it stood ready in a new square, clean, sharpened, and watching. In the days of the French Revolution, the guillotine had to travel. It was not just a fixed tool of death. It was a symbol. It had to be seen. It had to speak to the people, even without words. So it followed the work of justice, wherever justice needed to be shown. At first, it stood proudly in Paris, in the center of the city, at the Place de Grève, and later at the Place de la Révolution. But soon, it was needed elsewhere, in the countryside, in towns, on small village greens, where crowds could gather. It had to be moved. The guillotine, though heavy and solid, was built to be taken apart. Each piece had its place. The tall wooden posts, the thick blade, the pulleys, the bascule, the slanted board where the person lay. Everything could be lifted, packed, and loaded, not easily, but carefully. It was work for strong hands and patient minds. The men who moved the guillotine were not always soldiers. Sometimes they were carpenters, hired for the task. Sometimes city workers. They knew the wood well. They knew how to protect the blade. And they knew how to rebuild it fast, even in the dark. The move would often begin at night. A quiet order. A wagon brought in without noise. The pieces taken down slowly, wrapped in cloth or straw to stop them from cracking. The blade was kept covered, partly for safety, partly for respect. It was sharp, after all, and heavy. It could crush a foot or worse. When everything was ready, the wagon would roll out of the square. Maybe one lantern, maybe none. Just wheels turning through empty streets, pulled by horses that had no idea what they carried. The journey could take hours, sometimes a whole day. If the guillotine was needed in a nearby town, the trip was simple. But if it had to travel far, across fields, hills, rivers, the wagon would creak and sway with each stone it crossed. Rain made the work harder. Mud slowed the wheels, but they pushed on. Arriving at the new site, the team began again, digging holes for the posts, hammering them in place, checking every bolt and joint. The blade had to fall cleanly, no wobble, no delay. That took precision. It had to be right. They worked quietly. Even in small towns, they did not announce their arrival, but word spread quickly. By the time the sun rose, the townspeople already knew. Something in the air. A murmur at the baker's door. A silence at the well. They came to see. Not always out of cruelty. Sometimes out of curiosity. Sometimes fear. Sometimes duty. There were places where the guillotine stood for weeks. In those towns, it became a strange sort of landmark. People passed it on their way to market. Children stared at it with wide eyes, half curious, half afraid. And when the work was done, when the final name was crossed off the list, it vanished again, dismantled, carried off, as if it had never been there. Not every move was for a public event. During the Reign of Terror, the guillotine was sometimes moved for speed. Trials happened quickly, names were read, and the blade had to be close, ready. In places like Lyon, Arras, or Nantes, it was used so often that towns built permanent spots for it. Even so, it still had to be cleaned, maintained, and sometimes relocated to quieter places when people had seen too much. One part of the guillotine's journey that people often forget is the blood, the stains it left on the wood, on the street, in the soil. After each move, the square had to be washed, sand thrown over dark spots, sometimes straw. The scent lingered, even when the machine was gone. People remembered. They always remembered. Some towns resisted. They didn't want it in their square. But refusing the guillotine was hard in those years. Local officials could be punished for saying no. So it came anyway, and people watched from behind shutters. Over time, the guillotine moved less. As the revolution calmed, the execution slowed. It stayed in Paris more often. Later, in the 19th century, it was kept in courtyards or inside prisons. But in those early years, especially during 1793 and 1794, it was like a traveling show of death. Unwanted, yet impossible to ignore. One of the strangest things was how quickly it disappeared when the time came. One moment, it stood tall in the square. The next morning, it was gone. No trace, just a bare patch of ground, some broken straw, maybe a nail. But the memory stayed with people. A silent shape burned into the mind. Even today, if you visit those old places, the guillotine is gone, But the stories are not. The squares are quiet. Tourists walk through with cameras, children play, but somewhere in the stones, the old weight remains. The echo of wheels rolling in at night. The careful hands building by lantern light. The crowd waiting for dawn. That was how the guillotine moved, slowly, silently, and always with purpose. It did not speak. It did not rush. It simply arrived, did its work, and left again, leaving the townspeople to wonder when, or if, it would ever return. Along the Rue Saint-Honoré, the city stirred slowly. A baker opened his shutters. A washerwoman emptied a bucket. The streets were damp but quiet. Normally, on days like this, there would be a hum in the air, something uneasy, a noise that grew stronger by the hour. But not today. The guillotine waited, already standing. It had been moved here days ago, its thick wooden frame still stained from use. A few muddy footprints marked the base, left by the cartman who had wheeled it into place. But today, no ropes held back the crowd. No sellers of wine or gingerbread hovered near. No pickpockets waited in shadows. There was no crowd. The man set to die today was not a famous one. He was no noble, no priest, no man of scandal. He had not made enemies with a speech. He had not written dangerous pamphlets. He was, by most accounts, a quiet figure. A clerk, perhaps, or a smuggler. His name was written on a list. That was all. Inside the nearby prison, the condemned man had woken early. He sat quietly in his cell, listening to the sounds of the guards changing shifts. No shouting, no laughter, just boots on stone and the slow rattle of iron keys. He was offered bread and a little wine. He ate most of the bread, sipped the wine, and folded his hands. He had written no letters. No one was waiting for word. At the scaffold, the executioner stood ready. He wore the same plain clothes as always, heavy coat, leather apron, boots still damp from the fog. His helper adjusted the blade, testing the release once or twice. The wooden frame creaked slightly, but the mechanism held firm. They worked with care, as always. Even when no one was there to watch, the blade still had to fall clean. Nearby, a pair of guards leaned against a wall. They were there to keep order, though there was none to keep. One of them yawned. The other scratched his beard. A dog padded by, sniffed at the base of the scaffold, and moved on. When the prisoner arrived by cart, the streets remained still. No cheers, no jeers, no gasps. The wheels of the cart turned slowly, their wooden rims knocking gently against the stones. He stepped down on his own, led by a guard who kept a steady hand on his arm, but spoke no words. There was no rush. The scaffold steps were damp from mist. The prisoner climbed them one at a time, pausing only once to adjust his footing. The executioner nodded politely. It was not kindness exactly, but something close to it. A silent agreement. We do what must be done. There was no priest beside him, no final words. The man glanced at the sky, perhaps looking for the sun, but found only clouds. Then he knelt, placed his neck where he was told, and closed his eyes. The blade fell quickly, as always. It was over in moments. The body was taken away in a covered cart. The wood of the scaffold was rinsed with buckets of cold water, which splashed down and ran into the gutters. The executioner wiped the blade clean. A drop of oil was added to the release lever. quiet work, routine. By noon, the scaffold stood alone again, silent in the mist. A woman passed by on her way to market and did not look twice. A boy chasing a hoop rolled it past without pause. Life had not gathered to watch. It had simply gone on. This was not how it usually happened. In the early days of the Revolution, and especially during the peak of the Terror, executions were crowded affairs. People brought stools. They packed lunches. Some arrived before dawn to claim good viewing spots. There was noise, debate, tension. A performance of justice, some said. A warning, others claimed. Or maybe just something to do. Life was harsh and short. Watching the punishment of others made some feel safe or even powerful. But things had changed. Slowly, then suddenly. The crowds had grown tired. The names of the dead blurred together. One execution looked much like the last. The fear remained, but the spectacle dimmed. People stayed home more often, or turned their backs to the scaffold. The silence began to grow. By the time of this quiet execution, fewer people came at all. Some had lost interest. Others had lost too many neighbors, too many friends. The guillotine still stood and still worked, but it no longer drew the same eyes. The days of cheering and jeering had begun to fade. Not every execution was silent. Some still drew crowds. But this one, this quiet, empty one, felt different. It was not a turning point exactly, more like a breath between storms. A moment when the machine of death continued, but the people no longer cared to watch. And so, the scaffold stood in the fog, surrounded by empty space. The executioner packed his tools. The guards returned to their post. The city moved on. In the records, this day looks no different from any other. The name of the condemned is listed. The time of death is marked. The method noted, as always, guillotine. There is no mention of silence, no comment on the crowd that never gathered. History often forgets the quiet things, but the silence that day was real, heavy, still, not sad exactly, just hollow, like a song with no one left to hear it. And in that quiet, the guillotine did what it was made to do, whether anyone came or not. The morning after was a morning like any other on the surface. The sun crept up the sides of the buildings, throwing long golden lines across stone walls and narrow streets. Vendors were slowly unpacking their carts, bread, apples, onions, but they moved without much noise. No one called out loudly. No one laughed. There was no music, no singing, no political chants, just the light, the wind, and the soft scrape of wheels over cobblestones. The guillotine had not been taken down yet. It still stood in the square, quiet and unused. But it had not claimed anyone in days now. Maybe weeks. No one was keeping careful count anymore. After the terror, after the endless lists, after the carts rolled by one after another, people had stopped marking time with executions. For a long stretch, every morning had brought the same grim routine. People dragged from prison, loaded onto carts, their names whispered or shouted, their faces pale. But now the square remained empty. The scaffold stood alone, and the people were learning how to breathe again. A boy swept the street in front of a bakery, the broom rasping against old dust and breadcrumbs. His father nodded to him once, but said nothing. A woman carried water in a wooden bucket, careful not to spill a drop. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. Her eyes were tired, but calm. These small movements, baking, cleaning, fetching water, were the shape of life returning. Not everyone came outside right away. Some stayed indoors longer than usual. There was a strange feeling in the air, a sense of watching, as though people were waiting to see if the silence would last. Many had grown used to fear. They had listened for footsteps in the night, for a knock on the door, for the dreaded names read aloud at dawn. Now, with no names called, they didn't know what to do. It takes time to trust quiet again. Inside homes, windows were cracked open, just a little. Curtains were pulled back. People peered out and then pulled back again. Not because they were hiding, exactly, just unsure. They had learned to stay still. But outside, a few brave ones began to move about. Not soldiers, not officials, just bakers, candle makers, washerwomen, and young apprentices. They didn't say much, but they walked slower and they stood longer in the sun. At the corner of one street, an old man sat on a wooden stool with a basket of wooden spoons. He used to sell them during the executions. People liked to hold something in their hands while they watched. Something small, something they could clutch. Now, no one needed spoons for that. But he still brought them out. It was habit, and maybe hope. The fountain still ran. That hadn't changed. Water still flowed, clear and cold. A few children wandered near one, dipping their fingers in and drawing lazy circles. One of them dropped a stone into the pool and watched the ripples spread outward, slow and wide. They didn't speak, just watched the ripples. Across the square, where the crowds once stood packed shoulder to shoulder, pigeons now gathered. They hopped along the paving stones, picking at crumbs and feathers left behind. There was no rush to chase them away, no boots stomping through, no shouting to move aside. The birds had claimed the space, at least for now. Someone had hung laundry across a narrow alley. White cloth, pale shirts, a length of linen. They swayed gently in the breeze. That too was new. For a long while, no one had dared to hang their belongings outside. It was too visible. But now, someone had done it. A quiet sign that maybe, just maybe, fear was starting to loosen its grip. There were still soldiers, of course. Still people in charge. The city hadn't returned to peace fully. Not yet. But the rhythm had changed. The drums had stopped beating in the mornings. The carts didn't roll anymore. The executioner, once the busiest man in Paris, had gone home. No one knew where. Perhaps even he had needed to sleep. In the churches, candles still flickered. People stepped inside quietly, not for politics, not for prayers for the dead, but simply to sit, to rest. There had been too much motion, too much fire. Sitting now felt like a relief. Even the wooden pews groaned a little less. At a small corner market, two women whispered over a bundle of herbs. Thyme, maybe, or sage. It wasn't much, but it was something to flavor a pot of soup. They traded a few coins and nodded, then went their separate ways. These were the new conversations, soft, brief, ordinary. Not about leaders, not about trials, just about food, cloth, weather, bread. And high above, the chimneys still gave off smoke. Life had not ended. People still cooked meals, boiled water, mended shoes, but they did it more quietly now. The loud days were over. For the first time in a long while, Paris was letting itself be dull again. Later that day, someone walked past the guillotine and tied a piece of ribbon to its frame. No one stopped them. It was just a bit of cloth, faded, frayed, light blue. It fluttered in the wind like a flag with no side, no symbol. Just a sign that something had passed and something else was beginning. No bells rang that day. No great speeches were given. But for those who had lived through the noise, the stillness meant everything. It meant the shouting was over. The lists were finished. The blade was resting. And Paris, cautious and bruised, was learning to be quiet again. The guillotine did not sharpen itself. After the crowds went home, after the shouting stopped, and the smell of iron faded from the air, someone still had to stay behind. Someone had to check the thick wooden frame, wipe down the rails, and carry out repairs when rain, use, or time wore it down. That man was often a carpenter. He was not famous. He did not give speeches or take part in trials. He lived on a quiet street near the edge of the city, in a small room with shavings on the floor and tools hanging in rows. His hands were rough, his clothes plain. He might have worked on carts the week before, perhaps shutters for a shop. But when the scaffold needed him, he came. The guillotine was not a simple thing to care for. It was large, made of heavy timbers, often oak, and built to last through many uses. But wood cracks, joints loosen, iron parts rust and swell. And the blade? That dulled faster than most thought. The work of maintaining it had to be exact. A loose bolt could cause a jam. A tilt in the frame could slow the fall of the blade. No one wanted that. Most days, the carpenter arrived early in the morning, long before the workers who set up the rope barriers or swept the square. He carried a small cart with tools, wedges, mallet, oil, spare fittings. Sometimes he brought fresh wood to replace a splintered board. Other times, it was just a matter of cleaning. Pigeons liked to sit on the crossbeam, and the carpenter kept a rag for wiping away what they left behind. Once, he had to replace a whole step. The old one had cracked under the weight of someone who refused to walk up easily. The replacement had to be strong, exact in size, and made quickly. There was no ceremony about it. He measured, sawed, and fitted it, while the rest of the square carried on around him. Children playing with marbles, women lining up for bread. He never worked during the act itself. That was not his role. When the day's names were called and the crowd leaned in, he left the square quietly. He did not watch, at least not after the first time. He had seen enough to know what came next. He used those hours to return to his workshop, sharpen tools, or rest. But the blade was another matter. The blade had to be taken down sometimes, especially when it chipped. Despite its design, it did not stay perfect. Blood and air and heat made the edge dull. He worked with the executioner's assistant to unhook it. They used thick gloves and ropes. The blade was heavy, and no one wanted it to slip. Once back in his shop, he would lay it flat on his bench and run a cloth over it slowly. There were dents, little ones, near the edge where it hit bone. He used a grinding stone first, slow and steady, always wetting it. He didn't rush. Then he used finer tools, sanding it smooth again. When the metal caught the light just right, clean, flat, sharp, he knew it was ready. They didn't always replace the blade. That cost more. But once, during the height of the terror, the edge cracked badly, He remembered how it felt to lift the new one, cold, freshly forged, still smelling of the blacksmith's fire. He polished it himself. He oiled it by hand. The executioner trusted him for that. The carpenter didn't speak much about his work. It wasn't shameful, but it wasn't easy to explain either. His neighbors thought he built stairs and doors. That wasn't a lie. He just left out the other part. In those years, you learned not to say too much. His family lived in another town. He sent coin to them when he could. They thought he worked in construction. In truth, he wished that were true. He would rather fix a roof than replace a rail splashed red. But the job paid well. Better than making stools. Better than shutters. When the scaffold was moved, he was called to dismantle and rebuild it. That was hard work. Every beam was marked with chalk so he could put it back in place just right. The city didn't want delays. It had to look clean and strong every time. The blade had to fall straight. The weight had to slide without resistance. He checked every bolt. He listened for squeaks. He oiled the rails with care. People sometimes asked who built the guillotine. Few asked who fixed it. But without the carpenter, the machine would not last. His hands kept it working. His tools shaped the frame that made history. Quietly. At night, when he returned home, he washed his hands in a bowl near the fire. They smelled of oil and dust and sometimes something sharper. He would sit near the window, drink a little beer, and listen to the street outside. Wheels creaking, boots on stone. Life went on, and the guillotine waited. He did not love the thing, but he respected it. It was just wood and metal, after all, like a windmill or a cart. It was the people who gave it meaning. When his time came to stop working, he left his tools to a younger man, a boy he had trained in joinery. He said little, only showed him how to fit the joints tight and check the grain. He said nothing about the square, the noise, or the cold mornings. That would come later. In the end, no one remembered the carpenter's name. But each time the blade dropped clean and the crowd gasped, it was his work they saw. Smooth wood, tight frame, sharp edge, silent, precise, unseen. And when the guillotine was finally taken down, long after the crowds lost interest and peace returned, the last hands to pull it apart were calloused and calm. They folded the cloths, packed the bolts, and wheeled the parts away. Somewhere far from the square, the carpenter's last repair lay forgotten, quietly done, like all the others. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.